Welcome to Social Work Foundations. Today I'm going to look at resiliency during COVID. The reading that I'll be covering is entitled Resilience is Spreading: Mental Health Within the COVID-19 Pandemic. You will find that in Trauma Psychology. Defining resilience will be our beginning place, and then we're going to look at 4 myths. As we define resilience, I like to look at both of these aspects, but specifically look at number 2, the ability to recover readily from illness, depression, adversity, or like buoyancy. Now think about that. We know many of people who go through very difficult life events and they seem to bounce back or seem to fall on their feet. And we have to ask ourselves, what are the characteristics of those individuals? And then we can apply COVID-19 or even the recent fires in California. Those are stressful events, traumatic events, and how do people bounce back? So myth number 1, trauma exposure does inevitably mean mental illness. That's wrong. We know that resiliency and recovery are responses to the most severe trauma and adversity. Studies indicate that the high rates of PTSD were expected after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, but 86% of police and other first responders reported not having PTSD 8 years later. Then, 3 years after the SARS outbreak in Asia, only 10% of Chinese health workers reported PTSD. We know from these research studies that long-term resilience is possible and even expected with COVID-19. Second myth, resilient people do not have bad days or weeks. So here's the question at hand here. There's this idea that some people just always have good days and they never have bad days. That's just not realistic. There's not a linear trajectory of mental health or happiness. We have a threshold of well-being and a constellation of behaviors that prompt individuals and communities to persist and move forward despite adversity. Resilience can and should vary greatly. In the face of significant stressors like a loss of income, risk of homelessness, witnessing death or multiple deaths, having someone you love become sick, resilience might have many different appearances. That does ring true for us for COVID. We simply may put one foot in front of the other every day. We involve in active problem solving. We seek social support, and I can't say social support enough here. We share with others who are struggling, we tolerate uncertainty, and we generate hope for the future. As we make these adaptive behaviors while struggling and while experiencing intense fear, anxiety, or grief, resilience is experienced. Now, think about that. That's a person-environment fit that we've been talking about so far in the environmental person and environment approach to problem solving and making assessment of what's occurring for the individual. The most resilient among us will have bad days. It is not the absence of negative emotions, but our response to them that matters. Increased anxiety, loneliness, and sadness are normal experiences during pandemic, and they do not preclude resilience. We should not mistake pain for suffering. Resilience means continuing to show up and move forward, even when we're at our lowest. Next myth, resilience is something that you either have or do not have. That is pretty obvious at this point. It's not fixed. Resiliency is not a fixed construct. It's shaped by dynamic behavioral, cognitive, and environmental processes. Resilience is most strongly predicted by cultivating one's sense of social support. We'll look a little closer at social support. The idea that we're in this together, this sense of collective action or collective resilience, such as making masks or helping each other out, our neighbors and others, is a part of surviving crisis. This is a collective identity during crisis. We know that strong communities provide material and emotional resources when people need them most. We find the best of ourselves during these crises, and pro-social acts of tolerance, support, and kindness can strongly buffer against the negative effects of COVID-19. That is the buffering against the stress of pandemic. The next myth is the risk to mental health from COVID-19 is a hoax. Now, this is interesting because we know the term hoax has been used in a political sense around COVID-19. Let's look closely at this. There are mental health risks associated with COVID-19, and specifically, we know that in the short term. And we know that in China, 1/2 to 3/4 of healthcare workers have reportedly experienced depression or distress in the immediate aftermath of the country's outbreak of COVID. We expect to see short-term distress, especially those most directly impacted. This cannot and should not be ignored. There are also secondary mental health effects of COVID-19. Some people are isolated in unsafe environments, such as homes with partner or child abuse or substance abuse. These are real issues for people. Access to in-person mental health care and social support services has slowed down. Yes, that's correct. There's less access to social services and mental health care. However, we're seeing more and more in the telehealth. Stay-at-home orders may be reinforcing unhelpful coping patterns for those with pre-existing mental health problems. Secondary effects call for careful community surveillance and education when the normative acute difficulties shift to persistent, functionally impairing symptoms of a mental disorder. It's important that we recognize it's not the sole responsibility of professional mental health workers to respond. As a society, we have the opportunity to identify those who are hurting and evoke processes we know foster resilience, such as creatively providing persistent, positive social support and making collective meaning during those times. Let's look closely at social support, because social support as a theory is really critical for us as social workers just beginning to explore the foundations of social work. Emotional support is very obvious, and I know everybody's experienced it, and that might be something just as simple as asking somebody how they're feeling with genuine concern and expressing empathy. During COVID-19, asking your neighbor, even while social distancing, hey, how's it going? Are you doing okay with this? Those moments providing emotional support go a long way as people feel connected to each other and that they're not in this alone. Then we have informational support, and this is critical because we're providing needed information for better coping and reduction of stress. Think about the kinds of information. What does COVID symptoms look like? Where can I go to get a test? Is there someplace I can go to get a mask? Sharing that information amongst your friends and neighbors and general community is important. So information sharing frequently is now taking place via internet, text messages, and other ways, and it provides a sense of calm in difficult times. Then we have instrumental support, and this is the sharing of resources, perhaps even giving a friend or a family member a loan when they're facing unemployment crisis. In the case of COVID-19, you might be giving away masks or providing food banks for those in financial distress. You can imagine all kinds of ways we provide instrumental support. Maybe we give somebody a ride to the doctor. That would be instrumental support. And then we have appraisal support, and that is making comparison between one's circumstances to another's circumstances and having the feeling of we're all in this together. These are the 4 forms of social support. They're critically important when we start looking at individual and their environment, the person-environment fit, and how we may help people to adapt to their circumstances as well as adapt to each other in providing greater senses of support. Social support makes all the difference in resiliency. Thank you.